Hello, everyone. My name is Mónica Jiménez, and I am an assistant professor of African and African diaspora studies here at the University of Texas at Austin. I am trained as a historian and as a lawyer, so I spend a lot of time thinking about law and race in history, and in particular, my area of interest focus on the Caribbean and the way that law and race have sort of converged to form the Caribbean as we know it today. I am in particular interested in Puerto Rico, which is where I'm from, and understanding how Puerto Rico is made into a colony of the United States, and how law has shaped that process, has played such an integral part in that process and in creating what is today the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or the Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico, as it's known in Puerto Rico. So I'm currently in the middle of writing a book about exactly that, thinking about the kind of legal history of the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and understanding how this sort of history that begins in the 19th century continues to shape Puerto Rico's destiny and what it is to be living in the archipelago of Puerto Rico today. So, for those of you who might not know, Puerto Rico is a chain of islands in the Caribbean. It has been a possession of the United States since 1898, when it was acquired by the United States after the War of 1898, the war that was initially began as the Cuban Spanish War and then became the Cuban American Spanish War. And after that time, the United States acquired several island colonies, including Puerto Rico. So, what I am most interested is in understanding the sort of cyclical nature of how colonialism sort of replicates itself in the Caribbean and in Puerto Rico through debt in particular. So this semester I will teach a class called, excuse me, Debt, Race, and Law in the Caribbean. And it's a class for graduate students. But the topics that we cover are topics that I teach also in my undergraduate courses. I do have a course that I teach that is about debt in the Caribbean generally, thinking about what debt is. I think we understand debt when we think about money owed. That's the most sort of direct way of understanding what debt is. And so, in terms of Puerto Rico today, we understand that Puerto Rico is living what's been called a debt crisis. That for the past, really for the past 6, 8 years, the crisis has come to a head, and since 2016, Puerto Rico has been in a kind of process of bankruptcy and of restructuring to address billions of dollars of debt. But before that, before we get to the place where there is billions and billions of dollars to be paid, and banks that want to be paid, and a government who begins to implement austerity measures in order to recover money from the people to pay back debtors or lenders. Before all of that, you have the creation of a structure that allows for that type of debt to be incurred in the first place. So, part of what I teach and part of what I think is really important to understand about a place like the Caribbean and the way that the United States in particular operates in the Caribbean, and US banks in particular, foreign banks, is that they often aren't operating by the same laws that they operate in their home countries. So, for example, there exists in the United States a thing called the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, you might have heard of. And that is a regulatory body that ensures that certain rules are followed by financial institutions, banks, hedge funds. And these rules tend to be, though not always, they tend to protect individuals. They tend to ensure that banks don't create uh, very inequitable financial instruments, although that does happen. And it has happened very recently in the recent past. So it's not a foolproof uh, institution at all, right? It has its flaws, but it does prevent banks and lenders from acting sort of lawlessly within the bounds of the United States. The SEC does not operate in Puerto Rico. Um, and so that, that's been written into its operating laws that it does not apply in Puerto Rico. It doesn't have to oversee banks in Puerto Rico in the way that it has to oversee banks in the United States. So what that means is that the laws that are in place that would protect borrowers in Puerto Rico, or even the Puerto Rican government when it acts as a borrower, right? So governments, individuals obviously can borrow and get into debt, but also governments can borrow and get into debt. And so the laws that apply to municipalities, cities, states in the US don't apply in Puerto Rico. So that is a very, very simple, I mean, it's much more complicated than that, but that's a kernel of how you get to the debt crisis that is currently taking place in Puerto Rico and has been for nearly a decade now. And so without the operations of something like the SEC, a regulatory body that would rein in some of the worst behaviors of the banks, you get a situation wherein the banks are lending with extremely high interest rates, exorbitant interest rates, rates that couldn't possibly be paid back. Contracts that are also intended to not be paid back, contracts that are written over the course of 100 years, for example, with balloon payments. A balloon payment is at the end of your loan, you have to pay a big lump sum with interest. So those types of loans and financial instruments that are just impossible to create in the United States because of regulation were very possible to create in Puerto Rico and in other nations, right, where the SEC and similar regulation isn't operating. So that's just a tiny kernel of how you get to what is now a massive debt crisis in Puerto Rico. And the reason that the SEC doesn't have to operate in Puerto Rico is because Puerto Rico is not a state of the United States, right? It is a colony of the United States. It is a territory of the United States, what is known as an unincorporated territory of the United States. And this is a unique status that's held by Puerto Rico. It's held by the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, for example. So the U.S. still has various territories that have different relationships to it. Puerto Rico is the largest one with the most amount of people, so it's the one that is best known and best talked about, most talked about. But it is the case that the United States has various territories that it has various different legal relationships to. But all to say that it is the nature of this colonial relationship that exists in Puerto Rico that allows for this sort of lawlessness of the banks, right? So this is what I'm interested in. This is where I see law, colonialism intersecting to create a very unique but also inequitable situation. Because when we say that the government of Puerto Rico is in debt, the government is the people, right? So the people of Puerto Rico are going to be the ones to pay that debt, whether they had any interest in getting into the debt, right? Whether they didn't have any say, right? It's the government who is making the contracts, who is agreeing to pay the amount of interest rates that the banks are establishing. And there's also a really unequal footing, right? Because you can imagine someone who is in need of financial assistance is often not in a place to negotiate, is often not in the most stable position from which to um, create uh, negotiating points. So in the case of the government of Puerto Rico, through a series of legal sort of steps and missteps, the government found itself borrowing money in order to operate, which is not a good place to be, right? So there were sort of lots of different reasons that this happened, one of them being population loss. People were leaving Puerto Rico because there were not enough jobs. And that sort of uh, removed a whole income stream for the government, right? Taxation. Those were people that weren't there to pay taxes into the public purse that would then be used to build roads and build schools and pay public employees. So it's a really, excuse me, it's a domino effect that happens. And I I argue and I teach that that the reason that these dominoes could be lined up in the way that they were, and the reason that the dominoes could fall in the way that they fell, was because Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. And to be a colony means very limited rights, um, and um, and a situation wherein the U.S. government, Congress, has a lot of power to decide how things are run in Puerto Rico, despite the fact that the people who live in Puerto Rico don't get to say, right? They don't have representation in the government, and they don't get to say, this is how we want things to happen, right? We don't want these federal laws to apply in Puerto Rico. We don't support those things. We want to vote for people who have our best interests in mind. That doesn't happen. So that's part of what I'm interested in researching and in teaching. So I teach a class. I'll teach a class this fall that I've been teaching for the past few years, and it's called Puerto Rico in Crisis. And it's really thinking about crisis broadly. So when I first created the class, the crisis was the debt crisis. Um, what what is it like to live in Puerto Rico under the cloud of this debt crisis? And also, how did we get to the debt crisis? So, a little bit of what I was just talking about, right? But really going more deeply into the legal structures, the historical structures that have allowed for the debt crisis. In the first semester that I taught that class at the University of Texas, two major hurricanes came through the Caribbean and demolished the majority of the island of Puerto Rico, or the archipelago of Puerto Rico. And that was in 2017. And Hurricane Irma went through first, and then about 2 weeks later, a week and a half later, Hurricane Maria swept through Puerto Rico. And that storm was very well covered and very well reported. And it was a spectacle, really, because it showed how deeply impacted the people of Puerto Rico had been by the debt crisis first, and then the environmental crisis that followed, right? So that the reason that the recovery was so painfully slow, and the reason that people were in such dire straits after the hurricane was in part exacerbated by the fact that they had been living with this debt crisis for years leading up to that moment. And so their ability to recover was incredibly limited, right? The structures weren't in place, the infrastructure wasn't in place, right? The government of Puerto Rico was bankrupt and in debt, and so it hadn't been putting money into fixing roads, fixing bridges, fixing the electrical power grid, so that when the hurricane came through, all of that stuff literally fell apart, right? And it made it very clear how tenuous the sort of life on the archipelago was, right? How sort of, well, again, one domino drops and the rest follow, and it made it very, very glaringly clear how badly the neglect had been on the part of the Puerto Rican government, but also on the part of the U.S. government. So then, when that happened, my course turned into a crisis, the contemporary crisis, right? And we sort of watched and discussed in real time how this environmental catastrophe came to be, right? We all saw the hurricane pass, and we all saw the sort of immediate after effects, but then as that was happening, we were also discussing the history, right? So sort of trying to understand what had come before to allow that moment of disaster and crisis. And subsequent to that, there have just been a series of global events in the case of the pandemic, for example, that have battered Puerto Rico in very particular and unique ways, right? So the fact of this colonial relationship and the fact of this debt crisis set the island and the archipelago up to experience crisis and catastrophe in very sort of outstanding ways. So that when hurricanes come through, when in 2019 or 2020, excuse me, at the beginning of the year, before the global pandemic even hit, There were a series of very powerful earthquakes that took place off the southern Caribbean coast of Puerto Rico. The Caribbean sits on a very active seismic sort of tectonic area, so that there are actually a lot of earthquakes taking place um, all throughout the region, and sometimes they're very bad, as in 2010 when the earthquake that struck Haiti happened. And then this in 2020, they called it a earthquake swarm, which meant that for several months, not just one, two earthquakes, hundreds of earthquakes were taking place off the coast of Puerto Rico. And some of them were very light and nobody felt them. They just were picked up by the, the machines that monitor the earthquakes, but many of them were strong enough to be felt and to do quite a lot of damage. So many schools had to close because they had suffered structural damage. And again, this is all connected to a long line of neglect that begins before, as Puerto Rico is becoming indebted, right? Because as it's becoming indebted, it is spending more and more money um, paying interests and fees and less money fixing schools and rebuilding and building new buildings, right? Some of these school buildings are built in the mid 20th century, if not earlier. So thinking about that, right? So how this kind of layered crisis is happening in Puerto Rico, and it continues to happen, right? So there's just sort of layer upon layer of crises, and so that's what my course Puerto Rico Crisis is about, and that's what we will be doing this fall. I teach it every fall. And in this fall, we will talk about the debt crisis. We will talk about the environmental catastrophes following Hurricanes Irma and Maria, and everything that they revealed about the United States' relationship with Puerto Rico and the nature of aid to Puerto Rico, how Puerto Rico functions right now. Um, we will also talk about political crises that have affected Puerto Rico. Beginning with the debt crisis, as you might imagine, living in a place that is sort of infrastructurally unsound, right? That it feels so tenuous and so um, sort of on the verge of collapse, which is not always the case, right? But in moments, certainly like after Hurricane Maria or during this earthquake swarm, right? Lots of people left Puerto Rico, and you would be hard pressed to meet a Puerto Rican who lives in the United States right now who either didn't themselves leave during those moments or doesn't have family or friends who did. And so the sort of out migration from Puerto Rico has been massive in these past 10 years and has had a detrimental effect, of course, on the population that remains, right? Because when you lose that many people, and you can imagine that the people who are leaving are young, they're professionals, they have young children. It tends to not be the elderly, right, that are leaving, and it tends to not be the very, very impoverished that are leaving because they may not have anywhere to go, right? They may not have assistance in the U.S. Um, so that it's the sort of most young, most vibrant, most able to contribute to sort of shoring up the economy and the island that have been departing, understandably. But that has left a very large gap um, of population gap in Puerto Rico. So we talk about that as well, right? We talk about why it is that people migrate, how they experience that migration, what it is to move from the Caribbean to the mainland United States. And not just now, right? We talk about that historically as well, because ultimately this is a historical analysis or historical exploration of crisis. So the crisis of migration in Puerto Rico has been cyclical. There have been moments throughout the 20th and into the 21st century where more or less people are moving back and forth, and what that means, right? That has ramifications and impacts here in the mainland US, where in the communities where Puerto Ricans settled. So historically, the largest Puerto Rican communities in the United States have been in New York City, in Chicago. Currently, the largest population is actually in Orlando, Florida, which has been a very interesting shift to watch because Florida has been historically the home of a very vibrant and powerful Cuban American population. So the sort of influx of Puerto Ricans in the last 10 years has shifted demographics and dynamics in Florida in really interesting ways. Um, so those are the kinds of questions that we cover, right? Is really how do we understand this place? And part of the reason I teach the class is because I'm from there, right? And so for me, it's a really interesting and important discussion to have, and it's what I write about. So it helps me think about my own research when I teach it, and when I'm able to have conversations with students about how they understand what they're encountering, not just historically, but in the contemporary. But I also teach it because I would wager that most of you who are watching this video know very little about Puerto Rico. And that is not by accident, right? It is something that is woefully undertaught in history classes. It is a critical part of American history, but I know that, having gone to public school in Texas myself and having graduated from public schools in Texas, I encountered Puerto Rico very, very minimally, if at all. One of my favorite things to do whenever I got a hold of any American history textbook or world history textbook even would be to turn to the index and see if there was any discussion of Puerto Rico, and if so, what was it? And often in American history textbooks, I remember this about my AP history textbook in high school, there was a box, right? There was like the little side box. It might be like in the area where the book is talking about the Spanish-Cuban American War, right? So 1898 and the U.S.'s intervention in that war. There was the one box to the side that kind of talked about, oh, and this is Puerto Rico as well, right? This also happened, and that was it. And for me, that was really interesting, right? Just as a kind of artifact, like, wow, that's all we get. And then, then your teacher has to actually teach it to you if they're interested, which mine didn't or didn't have the time, right? Because also they have to teach you a certain curriculum. So for me, I was always hungry for information about this place that I came from, and I wanted to know more. And so it wasn't until I went to college that I sort of actively sought out courses in Latin American history and Latin American studies where they might teach it, and they didn't always. And then I would ask the questions, right? Or when it was time to do the research papers, I would go and those were the topics that I would choose because I wanted to know. And in that exploration, I discovered that while Puerto Rico is a very unique place, the US's role in the Caribbean has been vast and longstanding, right? And so that Puerto Rico has experienced US colonialism in a particular way, but US colonialism has impacted all of the Caribbean and Latin America. So that's really where my interest lies, right? In having not encountered it when I was in high school and younger, and being really, really hungry for that information. I think things are a little bit different now because of media, and the way that you all encounter information is very different the way I encounter information. And you have access to social media and other sort of ways of interacting and learning things. And you also have, right now, very popular celebrities that are making Puerto Rico known. Bad Bunny is the one that most readily comes to mind, right? Who's been very concerted about ensuring that everywhere he goes, he's sort of explaining what Puerto Rico is and the place that he comes from. So I think you guys would probably have much more information and access to information than I did when I was your age. But nonetheless, I think there is still a woefully it's a woefully undertaught subject, right? So that it is not unusual for me to encounter whenever I teach, if I give talks at schools, high schools, and elementary schools, or if I give talks at other colleges, or in the community sometimes, people will often ask me, well, what does that really mean that Puerto Rico is a commonwealth? Or, is Puerto Rico really a colony? Does the United States even have colonies anymore? These are questions that I get asked fairly regularly. And this is why I teach this course, Puerto Rico Crisis. And what I have found is that a lot of students generally my students who take the course are either majoring in Latin American studies or in history, or in my department, African and African Diaspora Studies, or some related, Mexican, American, and Latino Studies, some related subject that brings them to it. And so they already are sort of somewhat informed about the topics. They tend to be juniors and seniors, sometimes sophomores. But nevertheless, I find that most students who sort of come through my class and are encountering this material for the first time are really excited to be learning about something that they knew very little about, or that they might have heard bits and pieces about, but didn't really have a good understanding of what is this. And it's for me as a teacher, it's really exciting to watch you guys become really animated. And one of the assignments that I have my students do is to follow the news, right? Um, Especially in the last 10 years, Puerto Rico is often in the news for a whole host of reasons. And I always say, history is being made right now. And that's true for everything, right? Not just Puerto Rican history. And so it behooves us to follow that and to see and to watch and to witness it. I think another really interesting thing that has happened in the last 10 years is because there is now so much information available online that we have to be very discerning about what is news, right? What is actually happening versus what is opinion versus what is sort of skewed facts. So part of the purpose of this assignment that I give my students is I want you all to go out there and find out what's happening in Puerto Rico. So maybe every 2 weeks, students have to sort of turn in like a one-page write-up of a couple of articles that they saw and sort of explain, oh, this happened, right? And it's really kind of like almost like a investigative report, right? Like, this is happening in Puerto Rico or this moment, right? There was this election that happened, these people were elected, or there were this controversy, or excuse me, however that sort of manifests. But the other thing that students have to do in that assignment is explain why they believe the material that they found, right? So why am I summarizing a report from the New York Times, or why am I summarizing a report from a travel blog, or whatever it is? You have to sort of explain how you came to that material and why you think it's valid material, right? Either the reporter or the writer is a well-known journalist or a well-known academic or someone who did one-on-one interviews with people, right? That kind of thing. And that assignment allows you all to really think about where you are getting material, how you're encountering online, and really interrogating it, right? Is this something I should trust? Is this something that seems well founded, well researched, well written, well thought out? And that I think is a really critical way for students to learn how to interrogate media and information that they encounter. So it's an easy and kind of fun exercise to learn what's happening in Puerto Rico right now. And I don't make it, it doesn't have to be news, right? It can be like cultural news, entertainment news. Bad Bunny gave a concert, in two concerts back to back in San Juan and blah, 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 right? That kind of thing. Or it can be very serious news, right? The governor of Puerto Rico has proposed these initiatives, and the people of Puerto Rico are upset about it. Whatever it is, but you become informed about current events, and you also get to practice and flex your sort of interrogation muscle, which I think is a really important thing in our contemporary moment, right? To ask ourselves and really query ourselves where information is coming from. So that's part of what my course is trying to do and tries to offer. I love working with undergrads. They tend to be very curious and often teach me more than I teach them, or we teach each other. Yeah, and it's fun subjects. And I think the Caribbean, I like to say this, and I say it partly jokingly, but I think it's true. I think the Caribbean is the most important place in the world. And I say that because if we look at the Caribbean historically, we can see every sort of um, instance of kind of historical change, right? So it's the place where, slave-based capitalism is really explodes, right? During the transatlantic slave trade. It is the place the Caribbean receives as many, if not more, enslaved Africans than the United States. Latin America receives far more enslaved Africans than the United States does, and yet many students in the United States don't realize that, and they don't realize that, in fact, the enslaved population in the Americas was much larger than what was in the United States and Canada. Um, so so when you think about it that way, right, the place of kind of diasporic mixing, the place of cultural mixing, right? There are people in the Caribbean who are coming from not just Africa and Europe, but Asia. Indigenous peoples are moving through the region, right? So it's this place of encounter and exchange, and it has been that historically, and it continues to be that. And you can just see all of these dynamics in play, and you can see it historically. Um, and so I think the Caribbean is a really fruitful place to encounter history as it is being made today, right? So you can also see a lot of sort of where we're headed, right? Climate change, obviously, is the one that first comes to mind that is being the Caribbean is being impacted daily by climate change. Um, and you can see how communities are reacting to it, how they're shoring themselves up, or how things are being lost because of it, the impacts of it, right? So it's sort of on the vanguard of where the planet is going in some ways. So, having said all that, I hope you will consider joining us at UT when it's time, and joining us in LILAS in Latin American Studies, taking some courses, and really sort of studying what I think is a really vibrant and fascinating and urgent region, right? There's so many things that are happening right now that impact us and that we should explore and know more about. So, thank you for hanging out with me today and learning a little bit about what I do. And I hope to see some of you all in my classes. Bye. Thank you.